Okay, time to do everyone's favorite video format, tier lists. Hey, welcome to my tier list of the Season 1 Mythic Plus lineup. A nice, relaxing look back at the Season 1 dungeons and how they held up in my opinion, gameplay-wise. Of course, I must mention that these tier lists are personal opinions based on my time playing in Season 1. I'm sure that your tier list might differ in certain aspects. Feel free to leave a comment, as it's always nice to hear some perspective from people who play the game differently. I'll be dividing the tier list into two parts: difficulty and satisfaction. Difficulty is fairly self-explanatory. It ranks the dungeons by how difficult they are, across many qualifiers: dungeon mechanics, boss lethality, damage tuning, and Dugeon Timer. The second part will be about satisfaction. I'm sure I'm not too different from many of you. I enjoy a nice challenge when doing my dungeons. The dungeons must feel fair, and the response to the mechanics should be intuitive. And while difficulty may play a role in determining whether a dungeon is satisfactory, it is far from the only factor. When I finish a dungeon, I always feel a range of emotions: joy, disappointment, hate at myself for failing mechanics repeatedly, but most importantly, I feel a sense of satisfaction or potentially dissatisfaction. It's fairly difficult to articulate past that, so I hope that you, dear viewer, can relate to these emotions as I've described them when you're doing your own runs. Let's start with the difficulty tier list, and at the very bottom is Shadowmoon Burial Grounds. Not really a surprise, it is the easiest dungeon this season by far. The bosses are easy mechanically and tuning-wise, and the age of this dungeon really shows, which is interesting, because most other similarly old dungeons are really not as bad as Shadowmoon Burial Grounds. The first boss is mechanically easy and only poses problems in higher keys where the unpredictability caused by spell queuing messes everything up. The second boss is a joke, and has barely any interactive mechanics. You wouldn't think it would get much easier than the second boss, but you would be wrong. The third boss is so easy. The difficulty is only caused by the fight duration, that the boss slinks down into the water for a few seconds every minute or so. The fight just takes forever. It feels like a slog, especially on tyrannical weeks. Fortunately, the last boss is harder than the second and third boss, but once you get in tune with the rhythm of the fight, it becomes fairly trivial, with the only odd death caused by someone cutting corners, walking through the wall of death, and dying. The trash has its moments, of course, specifically the reanimated bones with their tank buster, and dominators with their dominate mind. But the bosses are so bad. I really can't justify putting Shadowmoon Burial Grounds anywhere but an F. Court of Stars is another easy dungeon, as the general community can attest to. Among the Season 1 dungeons, it isn't unusual for you to see people with Shadowmoon and Court as their highest keys by 2 or even 3 key levels. Mechanically, it is not quite as stale as Shadowmoon Burial Grounds, but it is still fairly easy. The trash of the dungeon is generally simple, but without proper coordination, the trash can pose a serious threat. The groups of imps, the constructs, and especially the mini-bosses, all are fairly threatening. The bosses aren't really hard. Captain Gerdo is entirely trivialized if you have a priest in your group that can mass dispel the arcane lockdown. Talixay is a mechanically simple fight and only requires a DPS and healing check. The last boss, Melandris, is really where it gets hard, but given that you have a good ranged player that can bait the clones effectively, the fight is fairly easy. The dungeon is short, and because of it, there are fewer points of failure, which just results in a dungeon with a fairly high success rate. A solid C is a good score to give Court of Stars, I feel. Algeth'ar Academy is where the dungeons finally become a bit more of a challenge. The dungeon is chock full of difficult mobs, several with lethal group-wide damage mechanics. But most packs aren't overloaded, and it all feels very manageable. Some trash is difficult, such as the battle axes in the Veximus area, or the skitterflies before the tree boss, but there aren't more than you can handle at a time in packs. With appropriate counterplay, you can comfortably defeat most of the trash in the dungeon. The difficulty primarily comes from the bosses, especially Veximus. Veximus, as a boss, just pumps out so much damage to your entire group. Between mana bombs, arcane eruptions, and arcane orbs, the burst healing required in this fight is just extraordinary. Croth may prove difficult with teams with poor communication, but is basically just a DPS check. Though the tank buster does hurt quite a bit, and may cause real problems for tanks that have difficulties dealing with it, such as protection warriors. The Overgrown Ancient is a test on how good your DPS is at padding the meters, but groups will still need a healthy amount of funnel damage to ensure that the fight doesn't take forever. It's a shame that Doragosa is so much easier than the rest of the dungeon. I think putting Algeth'ar in B is a good place, as even though it has its moments, it is still overall fairly easy. Ruby Life Pools is the tricky one. It went through several balance changes throughout the season, and if I were to judge this dungeon by its initial release date, I wouldn't hesitate to put it in A or S even. But I'll judge the dungeon on its current state. Ruby Life Pools is, just like Court of Stars, a fairly short dungeon, with few unique enemies, making it fairly easy to learn. However, the trash in this dungeon is considerably difficult, specifically the trash that surround the second and third boss. The Blazebound Infernals with their Inferno are dangerous and put a lot of strain on the healers. The Cinder Weavers used to be deadly, and even though missing a kick isn't the end of the world now, it could still cause random deaths when overlapped with Inferno. The Tempest Channelers before the last boss is strenuous on the healer as well. To be fair, the whole dungeon is taxing on the healer, as not only does the trash demand much from a healer, but so do the bosses. For example, the first boss is deceptively easy, but it actually requires a significant effort from the part of your healer. This intensity on the healer is a trend that persists for the whole dungeon. The last boss deserves a special mention. With the second part of the fight being an absurd DPS race, I've seen several teams just absolutely collapse at the last boss just because it becomes so chaotic, as people just forget how to press buttons. Then Kairaka lives for too long, and then the group dies because of the overwhelming damage. While mechanically, I would say it is harder than Algeth'ar, and tuning-wise it would be slightly harder than Algeth'ar as well. Because of the dungeon length, I would consider it fair to put Ruby in B tier as well. And now we move another step up, we have Halls of Valor on A tier. Halls of Valor is a dungeon I frequently dread doing, primarily because it's just so long, or at least it feels long. Halls of Valor has 5 bosses, and all of the bosses are difficult in their own right, with the exception of the first boss, Heimdall. Super easy, and Scovold, he's also really easy. Herja is an absurd healing check, Fenrir is also a pretty aggressive healing check through the bleeds, and Odin with his runic brand just collapses teams. The bosses require precision gameplay from the party, and any wipe is likely an untimed key, because the run back distance is absurd. Of course, my take might be biased, as Herja is truly a pain in the butt when playing Disc Priest, where even though I have some pretty good burst healing, I don't have that much burst healing. Fenrir is actually not as bad as it seems, as you can use Shadow Meld and Vanish to dodge the bleed stacks. But in groups when you don't have these tools, Fenrir can be quite aggressively difficult. Odin is the worst. A boss with a significant mechanic placed at the very end of the dungeon. Groups just melt, and people fall left and right when trying to get to their spots for the runic brand. The damage of runic brand is just excessive. The trash also can potentially be difficult. I can't tell you how many times I've had my melee DPS just disappear and die randomly due to mortal hues from shield maidens. It is definitely a skill issue for melee DPS to die to a frontal. On paper, it really shouldn't be that hard to dodge it. But even this far into the season, I still have a few melee DPS die here and there. It just happens. While Halls of Valor gets difficulty points because of the dangerous bosses, the trash isn't quite as hard, and tuning-wise, I think there have been worse offenders among the lineup. Though its length does make it fairly harder than most dungeons, so I'll place Halls of Valor in A. Next in the A tier is the Nokhud Offensive. Just saying the name gives me Nam flashbacks. Nokhud Offensive is in a similar boat to Halls of Valor, in that it's just lengthy. The Nokhud Offensive has difficult bosses and trash that hit fairly hard. Granith's trash is hard because of the Horn Sounder with his AoE Enrage, and the Chargers that apply a stacking bleed. If your ranged DPS don't know how to deal with it, they'll just fold over because it's just too much for your healer to keep up with. The same can be said about the trash in the Storm boss area. Unlike Ruby Life Pools, the damage of Stormbolt from these mobs were never nerfed, and they hit like a truck. Missing a kick on higher fortified keys usually is a death sentence. The bosses themselves also pose quite the threat, with a reasonable healing check in the Raging Tempest and the duo boss right after. There's also a coordination check at the end, with the intermission being quite difficult if the party isn't ready with AoE stops and interrupts. There is also a large density of mobs, which makes the dungeon quite difficult on some affixes, such as bolstering, explosive, and raging. The consistency required from the party in Nokhud Offensive is fairly high. Though to be fair, if all is played correctly, the key's timer is actually fairly lenient. A wipe hero there is not the end of the world. Overall, I think Nokhud Offensive is slightly more difficult because of these aspects, but because of the timer, I will grant it A tier. And now we enter the final tier, the S tier. Azure Vault is my pick for second hardest dungeon. Some may disagree because of the nerfs to the dungeon over the patch, but even in its current state, it is still fairly difficult. The dungeon is just large, long, and have mobs with small margin for error. The little lashes at the start that cast a group-wide stacking dot are disgusting if you don't have a plan to deal with it. Coordination is vital when doing Azure Vaults. If you decide to pull the petrified mobs, they can also pose a serious threat to your tank, with a frontal that applies a devastating stacking dot. At a certain point, if you don't manage your stuns and stops with these petrified mobs, the tank will just fold over and die, no matter what. The dungeon is particularly deadly to tanks because of the tank buster from the Azure guards in later portions of the dungeon. And through all the hard trash, we also have hard bosses. Each boss is difficult and requires accuracy to play correctly. Any mistake can potentially cause a chain reaction of events that will eventually result in the party wiping or falling behind on damage. Not to mention, a death on any boss is an insanely long runback. A wipe is almost always a brick when doing Azure Vault. I'm not sure if many can disagree with my assessment here, and I think it is more than fair to place Azure Vault in the S tier. And my last ranking, and potentially most controversial, is Temple of the Jade Serpent. Temple of the Jade Serpent has my vote as the hardest dungeon in Season 1. What makes it so hard, you say? Well, to begin with, the trash in the entire dungeon, and I mean the entire dungeon, is disgusting. Let's start by talking about the trash before Wismari. The casters aren't too deadly, and generally you'll only pull 1 or 2 of these at a time. But, just like the mobs in the Nokhud Offensive, missing even one seemingly innocuous cast of Hydro Lance will take out half of a player's health bar. This is on top of the surrounding mobs, those little slimes that spam Splash, which while they seem to do not a lot of damage on lower keys, at higher keys they absolutely destroy the party. Then you add the water elementals with their cast of Tainted Ripple, which do so much damage and has a dot effect as well. You should line of sight these casts, but the cast time is so short, sometimes I just can't help it. I can't dodge it in time. Not to mention, some of the corners in that first area are completely broken. Or at least I feel that way. Sometimes you hide behind them, it doesn't actually work. Then, the pandas on the way to the second boss with their throw torch and aerialist kick, the Shahs with their group-wide damage on death, that, by the way, are affected by raging and bolstering, which is complete BS. So many mobs, and each with so many important and deadly mechanics. It just feels like there's no time to breathe between the pulls. There are very few moments where you can catch your breath and say, okay, we've stabilized, let's go again. The bosses also deserve a special mention. The first and second boss aren't too hard, but boss 3 and 4 are disgusting. Leo Flameheart's second phase, where she applies a large heal absorb to the tank, is devastating. More so against certain classes that have difficulties dealing with the absorb, such as Protection Warrior. Any mistake from the tank here is a wipe. If the tank and healers don't communicate well together, it's a wipe. If the tank dies, you'll almost always wipe here, and it's a long run back unless you manage to B-res him. And the last boss is such an outlier, I'm not sure any other boss this season comes close to how hard it is. If you don't have a priest or a warlock that can dispel, the boss does so much damage to the party. The healer will very frequently run out of mana before the fight's over. I feel like this boss does too much damage in general, and they really should have thrown a few more balance changes to this boss, and this dungeon overall. The dungeon timer is fairly short, but don't let it deceive you. The dungeon is way too hard for such an unforgiving timer. I think it is absolutely appropriate to put Temple in S tier, even higher than every other dungeon this season. Sorry if that last part is quite long. I absolutely hate Temple, and I hope I never have to run it ever again. And that's the difficulty tier list for Season 1. The video is already fairly long, so I'll just very briefly put up on screen a satisfaction tier list. I enjoy Algeth'ar Academy and Ruby life pools. They feel difficult, but not unfair, and that's just exactly what I'm looking for when I'm doing a Mythic Plus dungeon. The mechanics are fair, counterplay is straightforward, and their lengths are appropriate. Nokhud Offensive is also fair, but the trash before the second boss takes it down a tier. I find myself holding my breath as a tank or healer in anticipation of a random player just blowing up. Court of Stars at A tier may be a controversial opinion, but I found it unique and creative, and I think it only loses a few points due to the few gripes I have with it, such as mob density, visual clutter, and difficulty. The Azure Vault and Halls of Valor invoke the same emotion in my mind when I think of them, a slight feeling of dread. They feel lengthy and punishing to any mistakes, as even a run that goes smoothly still feels stressful all the way through. Those same emotions are the reason I put Temple in C. Why put it in C instead of B, you may ask? Because I hate it. I hate the dungeon, and I'm spiteful. And finally, unfortunately, Shadowmoon Battlegrounds still remains in F tier for this list, because while I and others were able to do it at a higher level than other dungeons, it just wasn't satisfying. When you finish it, you don't think, wow, I finally did it, I did a good key. You think, that was easy, I can do it higher. That kind of feeling after a dungeon isn't very good, and I hope they never release such an easy dungeon in M+ ever again, and prefer that if they want to use older dungeons, they would more aggressively rework the dungeon bosses that are lacking. And those are my tier lists for Dragonflight Season 1 Mythic Plus dungeons. Overall, I actually think the Season 1 Mythic Plus roster is quite satisfactory, with only Shadowmoon as an extreme outlier. If you enjoyed it, be sure to leave a like or subscribe. Thanks for watching, hope it was entertaining, and I'll see you in my next video.